All right, AP World History students, are you ready? Are you ready for one of the most disturbing lessons of the year? This lesson is about the formation of the Soviet Union in Russia and the first half of its history under the leaders Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin. It's one of the more psychotic things that we'll study this year. And unlike perhaps some of the stories of the rise of Adolf Hitler, which maybe you've covered before in middle school, this tends to be newer territory for many students. So that's what we're going to be diving into today. This interwar period between the First World War and the Second World War really has some dark nooks and crannies. So that's what we'll be unpacking in these two lessons back to back. Our learning targets, I could describe the methods and motivations of the Soviet system. So how did this work? The world's first sort of attempt at a government-run socialist economy. How did that look and work? And then I can imagine the terror of living in Stalin's Soviet system. There's something upside down and terrifying about all this. And this long-term learning target, for all of period four, for all of this first half of period four here, I can imagine the darker undercurrents of modernity in human nature. We're really going to be living into that. So this story starts with the collapse of the Tsar and the Romanov dynasty, and we learned in period three that this was long underway. Like the Romanov dynasty was tottering and in really, really rough shape. World War I is what really puts it totally over the edge. The army was just really badly managed and equipped. Russia had not yet really fully or even really partially industrialized. It had industrialized only to a very small extent. And so they just get humiliated in the war. Russia's own soldiers sort of turn on their commanders. They turn on the Tsar. Nicholas II recognizes he's lost the support of the army. He's lost the support of the people. He tries to flee with his family. That story is not going to end well. And so when the Tsar and the old imperial government collapse, what replaces it is a provisional government that's a liberal democracy modeled on the style that you might see in Britain or to some extent France or the United States. And maybe there's some hope that could work, but sort of like what happens in China, that sort of provisional thing that happens between the end of an old empire and the rise of a communist or socialist system is sort of crippled with a bunch of things. This happens in Germany too. And the big mistake that the provisional government made is that they kept trying to fight in the war. They said, well, we have to honor our alliances. And frankly, the war was just a non-starter with the Russian public. They didn't want it anymore, and the army really wasn't equipped to fight it. And so the fact that the provisional government was trying to carry on the war, and the fact that democracy is messy and sloppy, especially in moments like this, meant that there was just an opening for radicals. And Vladimir Lenin, who had been once upon a time imprisoned in the Gulag by the Russian czars, and who had been in he'd been living in Switzerland, for a while here. He sort of returns to Russia, now promising a Soviet, what he calls a Soviet system, a socialist revolution. The slogan of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, which is his group of people, his party, is peace, land, and bread. And look, for a whole lot of Russian people, Russian peasants, they say, well, I don't know anything about socialism. I don't know anything about these Bolsheviks or this guy Lenin, but I like peace. At least I don't like this war, and I like land, and I like bread, so great, let's do that. And so the Bolsheviks are able to garner some level of support. I want to be clear, at no point did they gather a majority support. At no point is a vote really being held here, right? This is messy, chaotic, revolutionary era politics. And so in 1917, after a period of months in which this provisional government is trying to get off the ground, the Bolsheviks just take over the government, and they do this. They do this with the threat of violence. It's not a super violent takeover, but there's weapons and guns, and they just take over the government, and they quickly exit the war. They just say to Germany, "What is it going to take to get us out of this war?" And Germany says, "Give us a ton of land." And Russia's like, "Great." Lenin just says, "Get us out of this war," and then Lenin does that to turn his attention to this internal civil war. Russian civil war between the Reds and the Whites. The Reds were the Bolsheviks and communist supporters. The Whites were the everybody else, basically the supporters of the provisional government. It is a nasty war. I'm moving quickly through this just because we don't need to know all these details here. It's a nasty civil war, but in the end, Lenin is able to consolidate power in Russia. He proclaims the establishment of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, or the Soviet Union, the world's first socialist government, a government that is leading a centrally planned socialist state. And the 20th century is never going to be the same in Russia and everywhere else. And that's what we're gonna start tracking and following here. Now, so you've come to power. Right, Lenin finally goes from being he's an academic in a certain sense, or he's an intellectual anyway, and he's studied Marx, and he doesn't take everything Marx. He's not like by the book Marxist. I mean, he's a Leninist, right, and he has his own spin on this. But I'd say in general, Lenin is really going to struggle to implement Marx's ideas of a takeover of industrial class workers taking over the means of production from the bourgeoisie, in part because Russia is still mostly an agricultural society. There hasn't really been an industrial revolution. It's not the place at all that Karl Marx would have picked for a Marxist revolution to take place, right? So there's not many factories to seize. There's not that many railroads to seize. So it's sort of weird, like the wealth is still held tied up in land and the landowning class. And so Lenin is going to sort of struggle for a while to figure out, how do I adopt this Marxist socialist playbook for a society that hasn't really industrialized quite yet. And I'd say that, the announcement of like, hey, everybody, there is no more private property. For a lot of Russians, that's kind of like, what? Pardon me? Excuse me? No more private property? I didn't realize that's what you guys were talking about with the peace, land, and bread thing, And so the notion that like all land will be seized, right? All these things are going to be seized by the state, and all of society will be kind of reorganized and reshuffled to work collectively, to work together. This is not something that happens smoothly at all. There was a great deal of resistance across Russian society for it. Collectivization of agriculture is this old socialist kind of hobby horse. And the idea is, farming would be so much more efficient and effective if all farmers would sort of share their tools, if farmers would share their land, right? If farmers would all work together rather than sort of, trying to sort of compete for, and try and make their most money just for themselves. And the fact of the matter is there was not a groundswell of support for collectivization of agriculture. Yes, for some peasants, the notion of you go from being, you have no land at all, and you basically work as a wage slave for some kulak, some wealthy landowner. That was not a popular system. But what they find out is the notion that like all of us just sort of get moved to work on these big collective farms run by the state is not really that popular either. And for all the people who did own some land, a large amount of land or a small amount of land, the notion that all that is now going to be forfeited to the state is deeply unpopular. And for reasons that are like super easy to analyze for all you guys, people just didn't work hard for this system. We'll talk about it, and I'll show you some examples, but like the incentive to work, the incentive to push wasn't there. And the only mechanism the Soviets had was like punishment, right? Like we'll shoot you, we'll punish you, or we will withhold food. That's the terrifying part of collectivization of agriculture. So if all the land belongs to the people, which means the state, then like we grow food here, all the food is sort of collected by the state, and we give everyone else back what we need, and the state will sort of give you back what you need. And if you don't work hard enough, then we'll withhold food from you. It's like this terrifying thing where you are sort of like food becomes a weapon of the state. And production on these farms, like Russian agricultural production, which hasn't really been a problem in the past, Russian agricultural production just drops badly. Lenin in 1921 recognizes this fact that like we're just not producing. This is the Soviet problem, or the socialist problem we've talked about. Production drops. Lenin recognizes that, announces this new economic policy that says, okay, tell you what, people can have like little side bits of property, right? Think of it as like a side garden, like a small piece of land that you can grow and produce for your own profit, right? So some limited private trade that does boost economic activity just a little bit. Lenin seems to be kind of adjusting somewhat for reality. And then anyway, he starts having a bunch of strokes and he passes away and he dies. And after a whole long, messy power struggle back and forth, power moves to Joseph Stalin. And now things really go to a dark place. If Vladimir Lenin is an intellectual who's not afraid of doing some killing to make his point, Stalin is someone who just likes killing. Stalin is a sociopath who's obsessed with power and the preservation of power and the monopolization of power. And that's how he comes to power in the Soviet system. And the Russian people will now be the primary victims of this. Stalin dismisses the NEP, the new economic plan. He's like, no, we're going to do socialism. I mean, the solution to everything for Stalin is obedience to and socialism, right? Or obedience to socialism, which means obedience to the state. Stalin basically says the problem with Lenin is he was backtracking too much. He was too soft on the people. We need harder goals. Like we need to push the people harder. So he announces this 5-year plan, which is just sort of it's just kind of a gobbledygook plan. It's like, we're just going to fully industrialize this country. It will all be organized and managed by the state, and it's going to happen in 5 years. And all agriculture will be transitioned into state-run farms. And also, by the way, we're going to crush and dismantle the Russian Orthodox Church. That's our 5-year plan. And at the end of that, we will be at a place of sort of perfect, or at least the state will have full control of everything, and we can implement this full socialist ideal, and we can begin moving toward the communist ideal of the full sharing of everything. And look, I mean, did some factories get built? Sure. Did some railroads get built and some dams get built? Yeah. And collective farming happened. It was done at this incredibly insane cost to humanity, cost to human life. And also it was just done really, really inefficiently. And in many cases, ineffectively, right? Hydroelectric dams were built and they were built poorly because everyone's terrified to report to Joseph Stalin that something didn't work. So you're just better off saying everything's working great, we're meeting all our plans, and hoping that somehow they don't find out for longer. Because if you have to report bad news to Stalin, you just end up getting killed. And so it's like, again, it's not we have to be careful. We don't want to say no industrial growth happened, because some industrial growth did happen. It just happened at this fearsome cost. And also, not as much industrial growth happened as the Russians liked to claim, because a lot of it was sort of like rotten fruit. It just it didn't work. It wasn't effectively designed and developed. Let's talk about collective farming here. So this kulak class, the landowners, the middle class people, these are people who wanted nothing to do with collectivization, right? So like, this is my farm, this is our home, this is our stuff. Many of them, rather than turn it over to the state, set fire to their own crops, killed their own livestock. They said, I'd rather do this than hand it all over to the state. For Stalin and for Soviet propagandists, the kulaks made for a very handy villain. If something didn't work, it's because the kulaks, right? The kulaks were dragging their feet. The kulaks destroyed some of the property. The kulaks did this because they are only interested in themselves, and they are locked in the kind of the bourgeois mentality of property ownership. They aren't thinking about the good, the full brotherhood of man and the full socialist vision. And so they're easy to villainize. Again, the thing with like Mao, who we'll study later, or Hitler, there's always a villain class. In the case of Hitler, that villain class is racially identified, sometimes nationally identified. On some occasions, it's also like ideologically identified as like communists or socialists. But for Stalin, it's class, right? It's the wealthy, it's the middle class. They are the enemy. They are the ones who have to be punished. They're the ones we have to send to these gulags, these Siberian work camps. Let me read a couple excerpts from this devastating book called Koba, the Dread, Laughter, and the 20 Million by Martin Ami. 2 quotes here. One, launched over the latter part of 1929, collectivization was already a clear disaster by February 1930. There were differences, but Stalin had already reached Lenin's impasse of 1921. In the earlier case, Lenin accepted defeat, withdrawal, and compromise. In other words, he accepted reality. Stalin did not. The peasantry no longer faced a frigid intellectual, that's Lenin. It now faced a passionate lowbrow whose personality was warping and cracking in the heat of power. He, Stalin, would not accept reality. He would break it. Or later. Until 1930, the economy and culture of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is a province of the Soviet Union in Central Asia. Kazakhstan in the Soviet Central Asia was based on nomadic herding. Basically, for all of history, people of Kazakhstan were nomadic herders. The plan was to dekulakize these wanderers and then collectivize them. Once denomadized, the Kazakhstanis would devote themselves to agriculture. But the land was not suitable for agriculture. What it was suitable for was nomadic herding. Over the next 2 years, Kazakhstan lost 80% of its livestock and 40% of its population due to famine. The plan didn't work out. What we see in the Soviet system is crazy government-produced famines. Not famines caused by natural disasters, but caused by government programs, government planning to collectivize everything. You'll see the same thing in China. This is most infamous in what happened in Ukraine. So again, when bad news would come in, or when it's like our production across the board is dropping, we're not industrializing as fast as we should be, and our agricultural productivity is dropping. Stalin just basically made it a crime to say that. No, it's not. And you shoot people or you put in jail people who say otherwise, and then you just sort of fire out all kinds of happy propaganda like this. I mean, look at this image, guys. Wow, can you believe how happy all these farmers are working on a collective farm and how great it is? And you blast it all over the Soviet Union. And so people say, well, I mean, I guess it works. I mean, people just have this uncanny ability to believe advertising messages. We still do. And so and the message is, it works. And if it doesn't work where you live, it's the kulaks. It's the landowners. It's the old bourgeois class. They're the ones who are holding us up. They're the ones that stand between us and success. In Ukraine, which is a breadbasket region, it is deeply agriculturally productive. Stalin's policies are especially cruel. When collective farms in Ukraine aren't producing, Stalin just orders that all the food from Ukraine be taken to feed the people in Russia instead. This is called the Holodomor, and it's hard to estimate exactly how many were killed, and killed through starvation as the Soviets seized all of their food, but some 6 million. And so the Ukrainian people were basically made slaves to the state to produce food, and then all the food is seized and millions starve to death. It's some insane stuff. And to Stalin, it's all to make socialism work. We have to we've got to crack all these eggs to get to that goal of the sort of shared utopia. Stalin, some quotes that sort of suggest his way of dealing with things. Death solves all problems, he says. No man, no problem. Right? So what's the solution to any complainer, to anyone who stands in our way? It's death. Kill them. One death is a tragedy. 1 million deaths is a statistic. One death, if you're, heaven forbid, right? A parent dies. That's a tragedy that will mark your life forever. The difference between 0 deaths and 1 in that case is like an infinite difference. 1 million deaths, you can't comprehend that. Can you honestly feel the difference, student, between 100,000 deaths and 400,000 deaths? Can you honestly feel or appreciate the difference between 6 million deaths and 9 million deaths? I don't think I can. And Stalin basically said, you can't. And so why are we being careful around the margins here? Like, I'm not worried if this causes that many deaths. People can't even really take that in, right? Solve the problem. Get to socialism. Like, push through all this stuff. Stalin and the Soviets sort of put out this blitz of anti-religious propaganda, where the state is trying to kind of undermine religious belief, Christian religious belief, Orthodox Christian religious belief in Russia. Why? Because there's only room for one ideology in this system, right? And there's only room for sort of one. They don't want eyes heaven set, right, on the kingdom. They want eyes set now. Get to work. Get to work for the good of the state and everybody else, right? And so it's not like they just sort of killed every Orthodox priest, although Orthodox priests that spoke up would end up being killed. But they're just trying to say, hey, everybody, this religion stuff's just a whole bunch of nonsense, right? It's the opiate, it's the drug of the masses, as Marx said. And so let's move on from it. Disturbing stuff. Maybe less disturbing, but stuff we should be able to source is gender norms that they're seeking to uproot, right? Women of the world unite in the struggle for peace, for life, for happiness. Women break away from religious traps, build socialism. Sometimes students who haven't fully thought this through say, I think it's great how sort of open-minded on gender the Soviet Union was. And it's like, yeah, kind of. Do you know why this is the message? Because they want men and women to get to work in their factories and in collective farms for the good of the state. It's like they don't want women sort of having domestic roles that serve only the family good. They want everyone serving the good of the state. And so, yes, there's maybe less of a sense of like women being incapable of these things. But good sourcing analysis also tells us they're pushing for this because they want more laborers for the state's various, projects. Be able to think that one through, students. You're listening to this going, this is all crazy. This is like psychotic stuff. Why didn't people do stuff, right? Why didn't people do more? And the answer is the terror, it was called. And this is just where the Soviet state silenced all suppression. They suppressed and silenced all opposition. And to work for the Soviet state meant you were working for that part of just the tools, part of the bureaucratic tools at your disposal was killing dissenters. As one Soviet official wrote, he said, this caused deep changes in the psychological outlook of those communists who participated in the campaign. Instead of going mad, they became professional bureaucrats for whom terror was a normal method of administration and obedience to any order from above a high virtue. So killing people or killing the family members of people who stood in the way or who spoke up was just sort of part of the whole bureaucratic process. And it had this warping effect. And you couldn't speak up because then you'd become a victim of it. And Soviet executioners are just dispatching, like it's 1,500 people a day on average. Many of them were people who spoke up. A lot of them weren't. Oftentimes all it took to get end up on some list was like, someone, let's say I'm a teacher and some student said, Mr. Welle said something the other day that seems skeptical of socialism. It seems skeptical of collective farming. And I end up on someone's list and I just get arrested that morning. And that's the end of you never hear from me again, right? So it's just happening in droves. One thing Stalin does is Stalin is so paranoid that he ends up killing most of like the officer corps of the military. And unless he killed unless the way you could stay alive was to just obsequiously kiss his rear end, right? And just glorify and praise him. That could keep you out of the line of fire. And anyone that did short of that could end up, in some room where you sign some confession. They torture you, then you sign some confession that says, I was secretly a capitalist all along. I never really believed in socialism, right? And then they shoot you in the back of the head to end the torture. And there's all these documents. We've since recovered them since the Soviet Union fell. And it's like, all these confessions with like, blood and brain matter on them. It's some screwed up stuff, this Red Terror. And then coupled with the Red Terror is happy time propaganda. A constant blitz of propaganda about sort of Uncle Joe or Papa Joe, like Joe being the benevolent father of the country, Joseph Stalin looking out for everyone kindly. And people absolutely knew about the purges and the terror. And the sense of the public was the purge and the terror, these are terrible things if only Stalin knew everything about it. Right? Stalin is so busy looking after the good of everybody. If only Stalin knew more about it, he would put a stop to it. But it's hard to get word to him. But of course, it all was an apparatus of Joseph Stalin, right? And so, and the rest of the world is sort of shown only the propaganda happy time images, the happy time images on collective farms, images like this. And so there's like this endless procession of Western, generally liberal-minded journalists or academics who come in and they're given these kind of, sham tours of Russia, and they go back saying, socialism works. Socialism's amazing. I've seen the collective farms. It's remarkable. Oh, Stalin's a little rough around the edges. And oh, they gotta figure out a couple pieces. But wow, this stuff works, guys. And everyone's kind of stroking their chin saying, look, well, I wonder if they figured something out in Russia. Or I wonder if this is the next new thing. When liberal democracy and capitalism finally go away, we might have found the new solution. And Stalin's term for those folks, those outside liberal academics and intellectuals, was they're useful idiots, right? And he just felt like he could deceive them. We'll finish this with this one final thought. When the Soviet Union tried to collectivize agriculture, the whole idea was based on an untruth, a misunderstanding of human nature, and it didn't work. When they allowed peasants to keep a small fraction of crops for themselves to eat or sell, total production went up. That's the new economic plan. The lie was replaced with a partial truth. People will work harder when they're allowed to enjoy the fruits of their labor. In 1982, for example, 4% of the land that remained privately owned accounted for 25% of total agricultural output. When people can make a profit, they work harder. For decades, the Soviet Union responded to the failures of their plans by killing or imprisoning people that they blamed for the plan not working. In 1937, Stalin wanted the Soviet census to report a population of 180 million. When the surveys showed the real number was about 162 million, 2 million souls fewer than the census 3 years prior, Stalin had the census managers shot or sent to Siberia. Soviet industrial production was constantly bedeviled by the fact that it was all based on plans rather than the realities of human nature. Absenteeism, defined as being off the job for more than 20 minutes without permission, was such a problem that it became a criminal offense. Between 1940 and 1955, 36 million people, about a third of the adult population, were found guilty of such offenses, of basically just not working hard enough. Of these, 15 million people were sent to prison, and 250,000 were shot. In any year, there'd be about 1 million adults in prison for not working hard enough. This is some crazy stuff, ladies and gentlemen, and I want our exit ticket. Now you're going to fill it on Google Classroom. How did you come to see the darker undercurrents of modernity and human nature in a more complex way today? Thank you for learning on this, students. I'm sorry I couldn't be here for this lesson because this is a doozy, but nice work. Please turn in a thoughtful exit ticket. Thank you for your excellent work. We'll talk soon.